Shireen is here with us today. You can see her in one of the three little screens. My name is Alinde. I work at Fairfield City Museum and Gallery as the curator. And the third person you can see on the screen is Kellyanne Stanley, Public Programs Officer at Fairfield. And she'll be moderating and kind of working on the back end. So she might be muted for the whole time, but at least you know who that little person in the corner is. Shireen, I think first came through the doors here in Fairfield about 1.5 years ago now. We've been talking to her for a long time and working together with her on realising this exhibition for more than 1 year. As with so many projects that started over 1 year ago, COVID came and hasn't gone yet, so we had to deal with that. It definitely changed the course of your project, Shireen, which I'm sure you will be talking about later on. From our end, it's been a real privilege to have Shireen exhibit with us. Her show has really resonated with our local community, and we've been very proud to have her works on display. What we're going to do tonight, I'll do a quick intro, introduce Shireen to our viewers. Then Shireen will do an artist talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, talk about the project, some of the themes, the process, the concepts that you've been working with. And then we allow some time for questions. So we do encourage everyone that's Zooming in today to submit any questions that you might have. You can do that through the chat that should be visible on the bottom of your screen. There is a chat function, so you can just type in any questions there and they'll be visible to us, and we can get to them after the artist talk. There's also a Q&A function that you can use to submit questions as well. So we definitely encourage you to put your questions in there, because it will make for a more interactive talk, and Shireen is really curious to hear from you. And one last thing as well, that this session is being recorded, so hopefully we'll be able to put it up online afterwards. Just a quick bio. Shireen Taweel is a multimedia installation artist based in Sydney, and her work focuses on issues of cultural heritage, knowledge, identity, place, and language. Her artistic practice draws from the personal experience of living, working, and being, I guess, Lebanese Australian, and living between those two cultures and navigating that space. She graduated from a Bachelor of Fine Arts in 2015 at the School for Creative Arts in Hobart, Tasmania, and completed a graduate diploma of Fine Arts as well in sculpture a year later in 2016 at the National Art School in Sydney. Her copper sculptures and works have been widely exhibited, not just in Australia, but also in Lebanon, and very proudly now here in Fairfield. So Shireen, I might hand over to you, and we'll start the slideshow. So we'll just have some images of both studio visits that we did with Shireen leading up to the exhibition, as well as the exhibition that's currently up, and Shireen will be talking about the works.
Thanks so much, Alinde. That was a really nice introduction, and I'm really happy we could make this artist talk happen to share some more insights of switching codes. Before I begin, I'd like to also acknowledge that I am speaking on Gadigal country, and I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and any First Nation members that are online with us here today. So for switching codes, it's been a really long evolution of this project, which has simmered away in my practice for a few years and has really come now into fruition in my concept. Around language, it's really interesting because I grew up quite like in a multilingual household, and that's really just second nature to my sense of language and meaning and connection and experiences of culture. It's very multilingual. Throughout my whole education, it's included language from primary to high school and into university. I studied I studied translation before fine arts in an international degree studies at Macquarie Uni. So I majored in French at the time, and that was really, it was very much a focus in my education. And then I had the decision to go into fine arts because I think the creative pool was too strong in my interest to become an artist. But that strong, rigorous study in French and also into Arabic, where I've studied Arabic in many different courses throughout Sydney over the years, it's really played into my way of how I connect when I travel abroad and when I work abroad. Language is really important at a forefront to be able to connect with locals and share experiences. And it's interesting because having grown up in Sydney, I'd always siloed the languages. Like I'd speak English out, I'd study French at university and use the language within the academia there. But then in the household, it was mainly Arabic and that connection with family members. And similarly in Lebanon, like Arabic is very prominent, but until I started working in Lebanon and Beirut in 2018 and went there more for a focus of developing artworks and connecting with the local art community, did I realize that language there is so fluid, and that really shifted in how I considered my use of the three languages. And this term of code switching, it really started to play something of curiosity for me. How can you, of course, language is a creative means, but for expression, it's on a whole nother level when you're interchanging between languages constantly. And for me, that was a real new experience and a really interesting creative challenge in how to express myself. Why would I use certain words in English or certain words in Arabic or French, always in one sentence, to communicate and connect with another member or a group of people across Lebanon? And that really stuck with me. I think that was something that really took me by surprise, having worked there in Beirut. And so that kind of, sparked my curiosity to look deeper and actually embrace a real strong part of my heritage and cultural background, having these three languages, and to start playing around. And so I started to think about switching codes as a project I could slowly evolve and consider what type of works could connect with people and how could I share that fluidity of language within an art form that kind of celebrates this, I think, harmony between languages instead of sometimes we'd assume cultural divisions in those like geography and placements around, say, the Arab world. For me, it was actually more of a celebration of the three languages coming together. In one could say even creating a fourth language. And also, what did that hybridity mean when we mix up languages? What's that new product? And also it got me thinking about how languages evolve. So for a lot of my work, I often look into the past and look at historical context within regions. Like I love looking at antiquities as a form to kind of give myself research and inform the sculptures and artworks I make. But also that gave me a really great chance to consider how language has evolved since millennia, which comes from, of course, influences from many different communities and like language groups, to where is it going into the future, and how language is a living form that is continually changing. So that kind of where I began towards this show was looking at devices for listening. So I wanted to really like kind of flow through the journey I've had with language and that sense of listening to culture, listening to my ancestry from the past, and also in like considering place where here in Australia I very much have a strong orientation towards my family's homeland, Lebanon. So that distance is something I wanted to activate through devices of listening, that I had like these sculptural forms that I could almost activate my own form of listening that would connect me to the home of my family and like where I feel a sense of place in Lebanon. but also I wanted it to be like a form that anyone could imagine they could physically use towards their own body. And there's a lot of language references with engraving across the artwork and the piercing works also. I wanted to share how even acoustics could transmit through the sculptures. With the copper work also, it's a very activated material. So what does that conductivity mean in process making? And then also in experience in an exhibition was a visitor, is there a transference of an energy substance there? Is that really alive for someone to connect with as a sense of exchange in just the copper, let alone with the forms and the decorative motifs I use? So that kind of was the seed form of this show, of these works. And then that led me into also some of my research that I'd taken throughout Turkey and Lebanon, looking at old clay tablets and how language has evolved from thousands of years ago across the region. And these amazing symbols that have turned into scripture, and the influences across countless various forms of language, from Sumerians to from the Phoenicians, and right into modern day Arabic and then Turkish too. So I found that amazing how this tablet from the earliest form of scripture we have as proof of language has evolved into a way that today we still use tablets in other forms, in other technologies, and how also again the copper tablets are another way to activate that energy, and how language can be exchanged through. And it was really great for me to play directly with dialogue on those tablets, where just in the playfulness of language I had in my experiences in Lebanon of code switching, where I would mix up language, and between members, whether it be family or friends I had made in Lebanon, we would just interchange between the three. So it gave me a really great canvas almost to engrave on and play with language and blur it. Some of the tablets are quite clear and distinct in interchanging between the three language in those conversations that I was recalling on while working on them back in Australia. But at the same time, others I've really blurred over. So I would have written in Arabic and then blurred text over in English and then French. So it's very hard to kind of read. So it's a familiar sense of scripture and text, and maybe a familiar sense of language, but at the same time, I wanted that sense of also it's illegible, and it leaves you up to kind of having your own interpretation. And I kind of liked it was the tablets that you can directly read, because one visiting the gallery may be able to access the understanding of one language, two or three, but unless you can access the three, you kind of have to kind of jump across the meanings and kind of piece everything together. And I really liked that sense, because it kind of threw me into the deep end when I was in Lebanon, and there'd be different expressions in Arabic I had to come across, but then I'd have to piece them through with my understanding of French or English, and then catch up in understanding different expressions in Arabic that I hadn't engaged with before. So I found that amazing, that you feel like you can have a grasp of how you use language, but in another context it can be totally reinterpreted, and similar to how we use it across many platforms today. So I really loved making those tablets, and kind of embracing the medium of engraving, which I learned not long ago when I was living in Gaziantep in Turkey. And then into the sound sculptures. That was something I've been really keen to explore for a while, because I've been making sculptures with sound and installation. I've been using sound and installations really for that immersive experience, and that experience that can transcend places across space and time. But I'd always been stuck at times, some sculptures had required to use headphones to listen to and engage with the sculptures or the artworks. And I found that really limiting, because I wanted that immersive experience, and also I was really curious about other sound artwork that have come through like directional sound domes. So I thought, wow, okay, I not have access to that technology and install support right now with the sound domes, but how could I manipulate sound through my own sculpture making? And I've always been really interested in like instruments of antiquity and sound projection. So I thought, well, why don't I explore form? And I've got this, like, I'm really fortunate to have done a lot of research in museums and looked at these forms that come from different cultural backgrounds across the Arab world and time that have sound activation in them. Why don't I like play around with sound making in these sculptures that can actually direct sound in a gallery space, so that when the visitor is able to engage with the works, there are these sculptures that project sound in a very like intentional way. So that was amazing to kind of play with sculpture in another form that included all these other sensory experiences like sound, and how to display them and where to install them amongst the other works. And then the sound works kind of evolved through my use of language. So it's all of my voice recordings of different moments and time, like experiences I had in Lebanon, particularly conversation I had on the ground with a lot of different artists and even family members around the times that were changing and have been changing a lot in Lebanon's cultural climate, particularly last October 2019 when I was there. There was the big uprising of Lebanese citizens that were revolting for social change. And that was really amazing to really witness strong uses of language and how I could bring that in. So it was like quite relevant to right now. But also that use, like people would be demanding change in the political situation, and like a lot of sense, like we need social change, but it would be continuously communicated across these three languages, English, French, and Arabic. And I found that also really poignant about how global Lebanon is, and its diasporas across the world, but at the same time it's like very much rooted in the sense of Lebanon's positioning. But yeah, so the voices that you hear in the sound pieces of they've very much become like a tonal blur between the three languages. So it's a real interesting layering I've used of different words that you can't recognize anymore, but they might give you a sense of the context and the environment of a lot of let's say social uprising, and like there's maybe an influence of, you'd feel like there's some protesting in the tonal uses, but yeah, the language is very much undistinguishable in the tones that are used in those sculptures. So yeah, it's a really nice form of listening there, that then play out onto the tablets and then the other sculptures for devices for listening. Yeah, so these are the works you would see at Fairfield, and it's kind of, I'm really happy the way the works have evolved, and how if you have the chance to visit the gallery, you will walk through them and like have that interplay with very sensory experiences with the oral, with the visual text, very bodily too, which is important, I think, when we bring language back to that connection of how we share it just as much, because it's used across so many different platforms and means. And I really wanted to evoke a sense of, yeah, where are we going with language and how fluid it is, and ever evolving it is. And even with our use of technology and how we interchange between different codes, or we do adopt languages constantly without even realizing. And I think particularly now that I'm in Australia like full time, I'm not able to access being in Lebanon, unfortunately, because of our situation with the pandemic and whatnot. I do find it really fascinating how in Australia we do often have this like cultural barrier of openly interchanging between languages within our cities, because I mean, my experiences in Sydney, at least, is that we're very rich across so many incredible languages, from First Nation languages to adopted languages from our immigrant communities. And I just, there's been real issues with them being truly celebrated and embraced in our everyday language across all of our cultural backgrounds. And that's something I find really fascinating when I'm abroad, whether it's when I'm overseas in Lebanon or I'm living elsewhere or working even in Europe. You really notice that language is super fluid between people's multiple cultural backgrounds, whether that be their adopted country or like their cultural heritage or new environments they're working in. It's super fluid and playful even, and expressive. And I heard this expression that's kind of haunted me, that Australia is a graveyard for languages that are brought here. And I just think, oh my God, that's horrible, that usually in the second and third generation, the language starts to die down because it's not as supported outside of the household environment. And that's something I really wanted to reactivate in this exhibition, is not just to share my experiences with language, but also very much celebrate the richness of languages in like the context of the Sydney landscape, and particularly Fairfield. There's like over 40 incredible languages across the communities within Fairfield. So it was really poignant for me to want to show this exhibition too at the gallery in Fairfield. But I think this is a nice place to leave it for questions. If not, I'll keep going.
Thanks, Shireen. No, definitely. I think just a little reminder that people can just type their question in the chat. So Kelly just made a mention there to type your questions through there. So it's as simple as clicking on that little symbol and typing your question, and Shireen will be able to answer them straight away. And in the meantime, I think we can just kind of talk a little bit further about some of the really important and interesting thoughts that you've expressed in your talk. But first of all, thank you, Shireen. It's always really insightful listening to you, and it's really incredible, I think, when an artist is able to not necessarily translate, but explain the thought processes and some of the ideas that they've worked through and researched while making the works. And it just makes an exhibition so much richer to visit and to see and to take in. Something that you just touched on at the end that I think is maybe a good starting point for a conversation is the sad notion that you had heard Australia is a graveyard for languages. And I think that's in a way true, but I have seen very positive alternative ideas with your exhibition on display here, and the people that have come through the doors have really responded to your work. Even people that didn't necessarily come to see this show really, I think, understood the concept of code switching, most of them because they had experienced it themselves. And it gave people confidence to talk about it. So maybe your exhibition can be sort of an introduction for people to appreciate it and to value it, and maybe a society broader to value it. My question would be, what would you ideally see as a future for Australia in terms of languages? How do you think we should evolve as a nation?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. Well, I really love that feedback that visitors have really connected with the show. It was a real intention of mine to want to have that openness, to invite visitors to feel like they can bring their own experiences of language and particularly of their cultural backgrounds into conversation with the artwork. So that's amazing. You've had that response. I think there is change happening within our like cultural climate, especially with on the First Nations front. Like I see a lot of incredible poetry and music coming through, and Western Sydney definitely incredible creative work with writers and poets pushing that front of language that's integrated and also questioned even. but I think it's just, yeah, I feel like we have a long way to go on a broader scale with cultural harmony and language. I mean, I personally have had a lot of negative experiences, and that's really unfortunate that, say, if I'm out and about with family and we're speaking in Arabic, we'll often get some very odd looks or even told that we speak English here. And I think that's really shocking today that people still say that in where we live. But within the arts, it's, I think, a whole never open and very progressive embrace of members' different cultural backgrounds and that celebration. But yeah, I would even consider that the way that New Zealand utilizes language and really that acknowledgement of the New Zealand's First Nations language across placemaking and cultural practices and words is incredible. How it's on a government federal level, and that really like puts out the values for the rest of community and their society. And I think, yeah, we could definitely take that on a federal level in Australia, and it's happening little by little with placemaking and First Nations names of place. But yeah, I think in language we could push that so much further, and it's amazing. Like, I feel like it really take our cultural harmony up a whole nother level by just acknowledging each other with different words that don't come from, yeah, an Anglo background.
I think in that sense, having your works up on display here in a public gallery, so having Arabic writing and handwriting, and I saw there was just a comment coming through about that as well, on display and being visible and admiring the handwriting almost for its aesthetic and for the beauty that that handwriting and language can contain is really powerful. We had a group of young female visitors who were incredibly empowered by knowing that, you know, their cultural background, their language can be art, and then to hear that you are a female artist as well, working with such a strong material as copper and metal. They were really empowered by it, and I think that you have the ability to do that is really great. I might just read out the comment from Sue that she's just sent through. She loves the fluidity of the handwriting on the panel, so on the clay tablets that you can see behind Kelly and also in the on the big screen. And she mentions the loss of handwriting in the 21st century, which sadly happens through tablets and the use of mobile phones a lot as well, I think. Yeah.
That's a great comment. Thank you, Sue. Well, that's really an important point, because with this exhibition, it's very subjective. It's coming from my own experiences, but I also, the handwriting that I have there, of course, it's my own handwriting that then I've engraved through the tablets. But for me, it's significant because it's that sense of intimacy and those experiences I've had lived and shared across so many special people in my life, and that intimacy means so much to me. And it's like kind of reclaiming that again with my material, with it being handmade, and it's a really strong direct process I have physically and conceptually in copper. But I think, yeah, bringing my handwriting back into the work really gave me that platform to share and reclaim those intimate moments I've had also in language, and that, yeah, it's not just purely on devices that remove that intimacy that we can see on say a screen where everything's typed out. So that, yeah, that really inlined with my process making also.
Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the actual process, because I think a lot of people are really intrigued by the fact that you've adopted these quite traditional coppersmithing skills and you are still developing and learning, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you approach that, and yeah, what you'd like to learn in the future maybe.
Well, yeah, so I've been working in copper, but I really need to emphasize that I haven't been necessarily formally trained in the material, and it's been purely an engagement of experimentation and listening to the material of sheet copper and considering how I could work it and use the processes to speak back to my concepts. And I think what I'm always looking into was the processes that take quite a while to develop in making the artworks, is that important sense of time and intimacy that I can directly engage with. It's a very soft material, so surprisingly, if you give it a lot of time and patience, you will be able to see some form of like outcome that you're interested in doing. Like for me, my earlier engagement with copper was through etching, because I had originally etched copper plates in printmaking, and I of course was more oriented towards sculpture and form and space. So I started to think of how I could manipulate copper and bring etching and prints back into the sculptures, and then playing with form making, even though I didn't understand necessarily how to develop forms until I kept experimenting and learning through trial and error. But yeah, it's such a soft, beautiful material, and it's such an ancient material that's used. The first metal that's been used besides gold and silver, but it's a pure material, so the way you heat it is just so beautiful and soft, and you can just slowly develop it and form it into really delicate shapes. And the piercing through hand sawing, I found that an interesting direction, because I really wanted to consider installation and light into my works. So that's how I moved from etching surfaces of sculpture into piercing. So I would slowly hand saw the sheet copper before forming it, so that it had like this positive negative play constantly, which then allowed your play with light into space. And then that kind of lent me into moving more into installation and considering space and like those stories within space that I wanted the visitors to engage with. And then the engraving was incredible how I could access that, because for the first time I got to work with coppersmiths in Turkey, in Gaziantep. And they're like the master coppersmiths that have been engraving for centuries. So I was so privileged to spend months there learning how to engrave and be really supported in that medium to bring it back into my artworks, and then think about how I wanted to mark make and use marking into the sculpture. And then play around with different methods and processes into using the material that speak back to my conceptual research and development in a body of work or an artwork. So it's I've always think of like the old school artisans that, you know, I've been making art for about not even 6 years since I left art school in 2015. And if I was in like a copper workshop back in the day, like I'd still be an apprentice, probably sweeping the floor. So I have a really long way to go with learning my mediums and really grasping how to work with the material, which really excites me. Like I've got a whole life ahead of me to keep learning and experimenting and putting ideas to material, which is interesting. People often do comment like, oh, that's odd, you only work with one material. But for me, it's not just one material. There's like so many different ways to engage with copper, and then formalistically, and then also through space and installation, and using sound as a really important material too. These sensory elements like just build up such a big creative project that it's far from it's not like homogenous. It's like really like dynamic and like multi-layered, and I just feel like I'm really scratching the surface in how I want to work with the material.
I think we just got a question from Louise, who asks you if there's a difference between listening to language and writing language. So I guess the passive act of listening, or that can also be argued, and that more active writing language.
Oh, okay. It's interesting. I didn't consider the word passive. Listening, I think, also is very bodily and like expressive. When we listen, I feel like if you're directly in contact with someone in dialogue, listening is very like engaging. Um, and of course, writing is too. But I sometimes, for me, the writing has come more with the climate I was writing in. It was more as a sense of reflection and thinking of that. But then at the same time, I'd have small dialogue, but it was via online, whether it be with family or friends. Even at the time when I was making some of the artworks, I was living in Tasmania. And then like I wasn't in isolation, but I was far away from my family and I hadn't seen them for months. So like those spurts of messages we would write to each other would come back into the work sometimes, but there was definitely a sense of distance in that, and with the reflections that I had from living in Lebanon. But I think in listening can be a bit underestimated, that I kind of really wanted to like bring to the forefront in my work, because I think it's something in our climate of like hyper noise and hyperactivity can be a bit forgotten, and how important it is as like a part of dialogue and our sense of connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess going back to a previous topic of the actual copper, what I didn't realize, and what people maybe don't realize listening in now, is that all your artworks basically start off looking the same, right? As a piece of copper, as a big sheet that you cut a piece out of. Can you kind of talk us through the physicality and like it's very hands-on, your practice, and some of the some of the work that goes into actually making these sculptures?
Yeah. Well, often I'm playing a lot with paper and cardboard before I work directly on copper. So I will cut up maquettes and like use a lot of different cardboard forms, and it will give me a strong sense of what type of artwork I'm going to be making with the sheet copper. And I plan out a lot of different drawings. I spend quite a significant time in drawing before I even touch copper in my research and like studio development. So that phase is really important to kind of how the sheet copper will start evolving into a sculpture and installation. And yeah, like the forms and drawings are all informed from like my world around me, whether it be like through living in the Middle East and or like here in Sydney, and the cultural practices I engage with, like become key influences of what I put into the work. So like even that's informed by drawing, like it could be having looked at cultural objects or architectural spaces I'm in, and the decorative arts that will come into the work, and that drawing process is like, it takes so long. Yeah, because once I start working on the copper, there is a lot that can still evolve, but a significant direction is the beginning with drawing in my work. And then yeah, it's interesting, there's with the copper, like there's a lot of space for it to change, and that's because the material is so malleable. So I might have the form in mind that I've kind of worked out in cardboard and a maquette that I've made, and like I've tried to do mathematical calculations, which I'm hopeless at. Like I shouldn't, I was hopeless at mathematics in high school and really scared of it, and then I'm in a medium that constantly demands me to use a lot of maths. So it breaks my brain, and then I get into the material. But the beauty of copper, it's so soft, so I can really manipulate it in a way that it, for me, it doesn't have to be precise. And I love that, because I don't want to be too restricted and controlled by the coppersmithing practice, because it is for me an artistic medium, and it's one that I want to also have that openness and fluidity, and remain like yeah, really receptive to my process to allow things to keep evolving. So it's quite forgiving, which I love, that I can always hammer a form out or change it, and then at the same time if I feel like I can always sand things back, or I could yeah, like reshape or take things apart and rejoin with silver. So it's quite fun and playful, but again, very rigorous at the same time. But yeah, no, it really, like, it has so many stages. And then one thing I always forget and underestimate, which ironically like kills me each time, is if I want to refine the works at the end, like the cleanup is huge. Like, it takes longer than the drawing process, the piercing or the engraving. And yeah, it's interesting. There's times I leave my works really raw, but that's because I want to speak to those concepts. And there's other times where I refine the works, like the artworks in the Fairfield show for switching codes are quite refined. So there's huge process time in like sanding and filing, and then there's patina and waxing. And yeah, like, I think, yeah, the surface treatment is like one thing I should remind myself not to underestimate.
We just got another question from Jeanette, who also says, fascinating work and process. She asked, Shireen, is the script in your work more a collection of language or lexical transfers than code switching as such? It's interesting how you have created another language which you have embedded in a visual form. I think that's exactly what you've been trying to do.
Yeah, like I think what's happening with code switching in the context of Lebanon is very much people speak a fourth language. Like, it's not Arabic, it's not French, it's not English. It's so mixed and it's like interchanged constantly that I really see it as like this hybrid language, this new language. So I wanted to really evoke that, but I wanted to evoke in a way that isn't necessarily familiar either, so that it gives space for members who don't necessarily use those languages to also imagine what their experience of language could evolve into, like, in a future sense.
Yeah, I think that idea of having the familiar there, but not quite being able to grasp it, is there to a certain degree for anyone who visits the show, whether it's people that understand some of the languages, so they can, like you said, read maybe French or English or Arabic, but also in the sound sculptures, it's really interesting to see how people are immediately drawn to them. And what you were touching on before, of the active listening, that really active sort of leaning towards the sculpture. There's a bodily engagement for the visitor, and then they can hear things that they might recognize, but they can't quite understand what's going on. And that's really interesting to see. Do you think that is a concept that you like to explore further in future work?
Yeah, definitely. I like, towards the projects I'm wanting to unpack now. Yeah, like sound and manipulation and play of sound and the body is really key into the sculpture making I have. And it was really amazing to experiment and play with them for the first time in the way that I really wanted them to for the Fairfield show, and have these directional sound sculptures and have that warmth and intimacy of voice. But also, yeah, like I don't want to give away like too much, but yeah, it's a real curious sense of, well, we don't know what's being said, but it is very familiar and maybe more instinctual, and that's, for me, like something quite organic in how, when we're able to access these various forms of language, we would organically switch between each language. And yeah, I think by also having the oral, like the oral form and storytelling is as old as us. So I think that was something that was really key to bring in. And for me, before all of my academic studies, like the most deepest, most significant times I have in thinking about my cultural background is through the oral, and like connecting with my family, and that mix between language kind of starts there and then evolves. But I wanted to kind of hold on to that in the work, that sense.
Thank you, Shireen. There's another insightful comment from Sue, noting that it's interesting on the tablets, on the copper tablets, that the European languages are written from left to right, so they travel across the panels from left to right, and then the Arabic travels in opposite direction from right to left. And she says the two come together, it's almost a metaphor of cultural collision and difference.
Yeah, definitely. I really loved bringing them like together as a collision while putting them on the same page, because it's funny, even when texting or typing, there is like this confusion of how to lay out your like message and whatnot. Or I always deliberate on it, like, oh, it looks a bit silly even though it's accepted on a digital format, but I'm like, oh, it doesn't play truth to how I'd like to see language laid out. But yeah, I love that on the tablets, how they really do collide and like overlay and intermix. And I think that plays true to my experiences in Lebanon, that language is so harmonious between the three different forms, but then also culturally, like Lebanon is super diverse and like very culturally dynamic and embracive of many different cultural backgrounds that have settled there. And I find that really fascinating to like see it play out in language. So yeah, to see that in scripture is really cool, as definitely a metaphor.
Because I have obviously been working with you for a long time. I know that some of the ideas and plans you initially had for this project weren't able to come to fruition because of COVID. I mean, it's had an impact on everyone's lives, but also on your practice and your life as an artist. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how, I guess, the pandemic has interfered in some of the research that you were hoping to undertake, or plans that you had originally for the show?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for switching codes, I had an intention to also work and engage with French Arab speaking communities across France, in Paris and Marseille. And April last year, I had arranged like a residency at the Cité in Paris to work there 3 months. And really use that as an opportunity to connect with various members that use multiple languages, but particularly from Arab and North African communities in Paris and Marseille. So that would have been incredible insight into another, insight into how language is used in Europe, and I guess it's different cultural climate. I haven't worked in France for years, but I lived there as a teenager. I was really lucky to do exchange. So having that insight, I found it really fascinating how being in France as a youth with my like Lebanese cultural background and being Australian, it was like really interesting how it played out. And often people would see me more as Arab in France and not necessarily consider my Australian heritage either. And so it became more like a French Arab dialogue that I had with French speaking members. But then also I really was moved by connecting with French Arab and North African community members throughout all my travels and work in France over the years. So I thought it'd be really interesting with my artistic project to like have that side of working in France also, just as much to how I work in Australia and I'm on the ground here and have worked in Lebanon, to also have like that third connection to France with the French language, but how is recontextualized and used with the practice of code switching between Arabic and French, and whether there are other dialogues brought into that. Because I know, especially across North Africa, there's a lot of like local tongues that are interchanged and mixed, and or even Creole is really strong in France across like various migrant communities, especially in Marseille. So it would have been an incredible insight to kind of inform another understanding of code switching in a language. But yeah, so that kind of pivoted in how I had to like kind of examine where the dialogues are in this body of work. But I mean, France is still like pending. Maybe one day I'll make it there to further engage with language while working in Paris, hopefully down the track, but we'll see.
We're getting kind of towards the end of our hour already. So if anyone has a last minute question, now or never, type it in the chat so Shireen can answer your question. I think you have kind of said it already in so many words, but if you wanted for one thing that people would take away from visiting Switching Codes, what would your main message be for visitors?
Oh, one message. I think to not underestimate like the power of multi-speaking languages. Like, I think, yeah, like definitely it's something to be celebrated. And then like practice of code switching for sure. Like I want, if people are able to see the show, to walk away and consider everyone code switches at some point, and to like really kind of reflect on that and to think about, oh, how could this evolve? Like we're all connected to this practice somehow. So yeah, how are we implementing the language, and how are we engaged in it, and how active are we in embracing words that cover many different cultural practices and backgrounds in our everyday vocabulary and understanding of meaning. Yeah.
I think that's a really positive message, and definitely something that has resonated with our visitors here in the gallery. Maybe to cap it off, someone in the chat asked, what's the next project? What can we expect from Shireen in the future after Switching Codes? Are there things that you've kind of explored in your research for Switching Codes that you want to carry on further, or do you want to go a completely different direction?
There's definitely a few projects and ideas that I would love to keep unpacking and then go into. Yeah, and hopefully like I'll find the opportunity and support to develop them. But I guess one thing I've really wanted to further push with Switching Codes is considering how I can develop the tablets into prints and kind of return back to my love of printmaking that I haven't really accessed for a few years. So that's something that kind of brought on my interest and love back into printmaking that I hadn't even really had the headspace to like consider in a creative means. So somehow if I can access prints, presses, I would like to kind of play in that medium with the tablet and engraving form, and see where that takes me, and if I can push that medium was the concepts I've had through code switching and the show at Fairfield Switching Codes. So hopefully I can kind of pursue that.
Thanks, Shireen. I think that might be a good maybe point to end the live artist talk. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your insights. It's always a pleasure to listen to you talk. And I would definitely encourage everyone who joined today, who hasn't visited, to come out to Smithfield to visit FCMG. Switching Codes is on for a few more days only. It closes on Saturday. We're open from 10 a.m. till 4 p.m. and on Saturday from 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. Thank you all for joining our chat. Thanks, Shireen, for your beautiful talk, and we'll see you sometime in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.